y'all, I'm Angela, and today I wanted to talk a little bit about the current writing process that I have from blank page to the stories that I am currently submitting to magazines. Every one of my stories is going to start out in my notebook. I have a couple of running lists of story ideas. So generally, when I am ready to start a new story, I actually just go in and look at those lists until I find something that I feel like talking about. Usually I'll just take one idea. Sometimes I'll smush a couple together, but in my experience, one and then some setting or character that kind of grows iteratively as I play with that idea tends to be about the right amount for the lengths that I'm working with, which is really anywhere from now about 300 to 6,500 words. So that is the first thing I do. And then I continue to stay in this notebook for a bit. I find it way less intimidating to handwrite than to type for whatever reason. So all of my brainstorming happens in here. What that process looks like will be really different based on the story. So sometimes there'll be a good amount of research. Sometimes it's just sort of journaling about the idea. Often I'll end up just sort of zero drafting or discovery drafting my way into a story so I can get a feel for the tone and the pacing and the characters, and eventually I'll start building an outline. So just bullet points of what I think will happen. And then I get to move into my least favorite part of the process, which is drafting. I hate drafting so much. It is so painful. And I definitely need to be figuring out ways to make it faster, because I think part of what happens is that I end up writing really slow and then just like sitting in the suck. And that's not ideal. I will basically start drafting on Scrivener and just writing out a draft of my story. It's very painful. Sometimes I'll get stuck halfway through and move back to my notebook. Usually my first outline is basically just bullets of what's going to happen. And oftentimes, if I go back because I'm really struggling with a story, I'll write out more in depth the scenes themselves and what needs to happen in each scene. And that is something that is hard for me to do unless I'm pretty far into a story, but is helpful when I pull it off. So that is something that I will often do if I get stuck. Eventually, I have a draft, and then I will collapse into a little puddle and leave that draft alone for a bit. I try and rest all of my stories in between revision rounds. The length that I end up resting it will vary wildly based on things like how much I hate the story when I finish drafting it, and how much I am supposed to submit something to my critique group and have not. So I'll rest it for anywhere from like a couple of days to a few weeks, and then I will return to the story and do my first round of revisions. This is an area that really changes based on the story. Sometimes I'll have to like change the tense or the point of view, which is not fun. Or I'll have to really rework plot things that I already knew in the first draft weren't really working. The one thing that does tend to generally happen in this first revision pass is that I will name anything that hasn't been named yet. I hate naming almost as much as I hate drafting, so I don't make myself name when I'm drafting. So I'll name things, and then the other thing that always happens is I end up cutting words. So the current story that I just finished round 1 revisions on, I ended up cutting about 1,000 words from what was originally a 7,500 word piece. I'm a notorious overwriter. I'm just a very wordy human, and so a lot of that will just be tightening. And then also any things that I know are problems, I want to change before I give my story to my critique group, because I want them to be giving me feedback on things that I don't know are problems instead of things that I do know are problems and I should have already fixed. So eventually I will finish my first round of revisions, and then I will submit my story to my critique group, and then my critique group reads it. We will then all get together. They will have done line edits on the manuscript itself, and then we will have sort of a conversation about the story, what's working and what's not, and I will take notes during that time. Then sometimes I will rest the story again, and sometimes I will get right into revisions. It really depends often on the timeline around my first revisions. So if I was submitting to my critique group like a day or two before we met, then I'll probably rest the story after we talk about it. If I was really on top of things and submitted to my critique group early, then sometimes I'll get right into revisions after we meet. I'll do sort of a big read through and edit based on the things that we discussed. So things that everyone agreed needed to change, or if there were things that like there were disagreements on, some people liked, some people wanted to change, I will then make the call of how I think that the story should go and make those edits as well. Once I've done sort of my initial pass based on the notes that everyone gave me, I'll go through and look at their line edits and then revise things based on the actual things that they wrote on the manuscript. Then I will take some time, maybe rest it again, maybe keep editing on my own, basically getting to the point where any new changes that have arisen are made. So if there's anything else that I realized after the fact wasn't working, or that I had to change based on the changes made from my critique group, I'll do those things. And then at that point, the story's getting pretty close to done for me. So I'll send it off to one or two of my friends who don't write as much in fantasy, but do read a good amount. And so I will have them read my story. That is definitely the point at which I am looking for a little bit of encouragement, looking for someone to be like, yes, this is a real story and it is okay and you can submit it. But also if there were things that I had to clarify or change based on my notes from my critique group, then when I'm giving it to my friends to read, I will make sure that those things make sense. Sometimes I'll get feedback, but sometimes I will basically just get a green light. I'll do some amount of editing based on their feedback, and then I move into polishing. So first off, I will read the story out loud and edit for flow as I go. I'm a really auditory processor, so that works really well for me. And then I will do a final pass where I read the story backwards, sentence by sentence, to find grammar mistakes. It sucks, but it works. There is no way I would do it for a longer work, but the thing about short fiction is A, it's pretty short, and B, there aren't that many passes between what I finish and what would theoretically get published in a magazine, so I really want to make sure that I am doing all of that work. Once I have done that, I'm basically done. At that point, I will go on Submission Grinder, which is this amazing website that tracks all of your stories and submissions and also all of the markets that your story is eligible for. And I will find sort of the market that makes the most sense to submit to first. I will enter that story on Submission Grinder, and then I'll do any formatting that needs to get done and then send it off into the ether. Sometimes different publications, when they reject you, will give you feedback. For the most part, I don't edit stories again. In one case, I ended up cutting a story basically in half so that I could submit it to a market that it had been too long for before. But in most cases, once I have read the whole thing freaking backwards, it's done, I'm moving on. I try not to fixate on one thing too much because I think that I probably learn more from doing a new story. So that is really like it for the story at that point. And I basically just keep sending it out as I get rejected, or right now it just sits on my computer until eventually I get my life together and start submitting again. But that is really my whole process at this point. I'm assuming that it will probably change some moving forward, but for now it feels pretty good. It feels like a good mixture of being pretty rigorous without spending like my entire life on one story. If you have any questions about my revision process, please leave them down below, and I would love to hear about y'all's revision processes. If you liked this video, go ahead and give it a little thumbs up. If you are curious about my writing endeavors, feel free to subscribe and stick around. And I think that is about it for me, folks. Thanks, y'all. Be well.